and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm at Macy's in Chicago, taking you through their interesting flower festival, and I thought I would talk a little bit about regionalism and theming through plants. So let's go around and take a look. And so I plan to take you through the many stills that I took during my visit to the Macy's flower show, and this is a bit untraditional, I would say, in terms of a focus on theming. If you saw my video on theming stickers from a shop in SoCal, this is very similar to that, to look at the significance of theming in this sense. Now we're looking here at the amazing structure here. You can see the multiple floors of Macy's, which of course used to be, if you know the history, Marshall Field's, one of the great early department stores in the United States. The history goes back, well over close to 100 years. And another side of this, I would say, would be to look at Macy's / Marshall Field's as a site of retail significance. And there's a curious historical display you can check out on one of the floors if you have the opportunity to visit. And I would certainly say that, like Harrods and many other department stores throughout Europe and the United States, Macy's Marshall Field's has a significance and should be understood also from that perspective. But let's go back to then this annual flower show, which I basically stumbled across when I was visiting Chicago. And on the exterior of the building, you'll notice actually there isn't a Pacific section inside the flower show, but they had on the outskirts and the outdoors of the windows surrounding Macy's some of the displays to sort of pique the interest of the guest to presumably go up the many floors to visit the show. You can also see here then on their website they preview the various regions we'll be looking at, ranging from the Southeast, the Rockies, the Midwest, the Northwest, the Southwest, and the Northeast. So in this video, what I'd like to focus on then is this idea of regionalism, and specifically how regions, whether geographically or culturally, can influence our understandings of theming, or how we might go about theming other spaces. So of course, very properly, flora and fauna, the animals, the natural features, the geography, the plants, as we'll see here, impact how we maybe think about theming a space, because those are some of the entities that occur naturally or are the results of human inhabitation and domestication and so forth. So I think it's important to remember that the flora and fauna of any given region quite obviously will impact how we think about that region in terms of theming any number of spaces based on those regions. Okay, and as we continue here on our tour, we see the Southeast. So again, you can look at some specific choices here in terms of the flowers and the design. But this next issue is about architecture and design. And what we should think about is that the flora and fauna indigenous to any region, whether naturally occurring or the part of domestication by humans, has an impact on the type of design. So if it's a humid climate versus a warm climate, quite obviously, I'll talk about this in the Immersive Worlds Handbook a little bit, you might have a roof design, paint, exterior, interior choices based on some practical concerns. Cooling, temperature, not everything relates to aesthetic or choice. But on the other hand, we do have that opportunity, unlike other species, to say, well, because of new technology, we aren't stuck with the same design patterns that we had in the past. We look here at the Rockies next. And the other thing to note here is that as you see how they've laid out the various flora here, it's quite amazing to think about this project just from the perspective of bringing in all these plants and doing something on this level in terms of the sheer scale of this. And I think that's what made it so cool, is that they developed the theme of each garden area based on some key characteristics. One of those, of course, could be subsistence. So the Midwest, we might think of farms, and therefore farms perhaps are represented with this barn here as part of that tradition. And then of course we're going to see plants, be it corn or other plants, that go along with that region. Not that some of those plants couldn't be found in other regions as well, but quite obviously we're going to associate, as we do with all theming, the plants of that region with that region, except in cases maybe where there's a good reason not to do so, and we'd have to think about why that might be the case. And in looking at all the flora here, I'm reminded of the fact that Going back to pleasure gardens and Chinese gardens, there are traditions going back hundreds of years of using plants as a means of thematically creating a symbolic space. Now we're looking here at the Northwest, which I have to say was one of my favorite of the regions that they portrayed, with the redwoods, some of the reconstructions that you'll see here in a second. I thought were pretty innovative. This is, by the way, a relatively small space up on one of the upper floors of Macys. And you can see here, like we might see in the Pacific Northwest, you could walk through one of the giant redwood or sequoia trees. So pretty cool. And part of the undertaking here, obviously, is to create some iconic associations that people would have that would connect them with the plants, and then you could explore the plants in a little more detail. So I think a unique way to think about theming. You can also look at this here, right, and consider the uniqueness of certain traditions, camping and tourism and traveling and so forth, and how that is also associated with that particular region. And that being said, as we move away from the campers into the Southwest region, I think we have to consider that regionalism also reminds us of lifestyle. So what are some specific things that people do, enjoy, hobbies, beyond things like subsistence and architecture and the flora and fauna that we're talking about? Not a lot of that gets represented here, but certainly in other theme spaces, including theme casinos and theme parks, the lifestyle components get highlighted, I think, in an even more dramatic sense. I really enjoyed what they did with the cacti here. A really unique, I think, approach here. Again, some of the color choices obviously very indigenous to those regions. Now, this does raise a question. I'll ask a few questions of us here as we close this video out. One is that of stereotyping and essentialism. We come to that issue in any theme space that we might consider. So in other words, is it a problem if we begin to associate, in this case we're looking at the plants, but is that a problem if we associate only certain plants with those regions? The same thing then gets applied to theme spaces. So I go to the Paris, Las Vegas, and I see the Eiffel Tower or certain cobblestone streets or certain architectural features or forms of performance and so forth. The question then remains, is that a problem? Essentialism suggests that we're attaching essences to certain places, to certain moments, to certain cultures and lifestyles, and perhaps that's a problem, and perhaps that's something we need to challenge in terms of looking at theming and the varieties of theme spaces that we consider in the world. So this is a question, I think, for us to consider in the future as we move beyond the Macy's Flower Show and consider other theme spaces that might also attract our interest. And next we move to our final region, or the Northeast. And you'll see with the Northeast we get a bit of the Cape Cod nautical fishing, as well as the DC cherry blossoms and all the majesty that they connote for that region. And I thought I would use this last region as an opportunity to think then about a second related issue, and this is that of realism versus abstraction. So quite obviously, if you're taking actual plants and somewhat reworking those for a display like this, you're probably choosing realism as a design approach. But for other theme spaces, the question becomes, when we think about how that regionalism gets attached to those spaces in all these forms we've talked about today, do we have to focus only on realistic representational design? And I'm thinking, of course, of themed casinos like the Venetian, the Paris and Las Vegas, to some extent the New York. Do we have to use representational approaches, or can we use abstraction? Now, some of what we looked at today in terms of these influences on theme spaces, I think maybe promote less of the abstraction, even the avant-garde, and certainly the conceptual, and tend to focus us more on this idea that there are these, to reference that earlier point, certain essences that we attach to these spaces, perhaps because of those early natural indicators or markers on our consciousness in terms of the various plants and flowers and all the flora that we see in these regions. So I think it's something for us to consider today as we move beyond the Macy's Flower Show and move into other theme spaces that might also interest us. I hope you enjoyed this video feature today here looking at the very interesting and unique Macy's Flower Show, considering the issue of regional theming and what it says about how we conceive of the world and how we further respatialize that world in the wake of this all. So please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.